Welcome. We are going to get started. My name is Daniela Bleichmar. I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities at USC, and I am delighted to welcome you all to a conversation about Lindsay O'Neill's brand new book, The Two Princes of Mpfumo, an Early 18th-Century Journey into and out of slavery, out this year from the University of Pennsylvania Press. Our partners for this program are the Hunnick History Department at USC and the Early Modern Studies Institute. Today we will be hearing, of course, from the author, Lindsay O'Neill, who is Associate Professor of Teaching of History at USC, Catherine Molineux, who is Associate Professor of History at Vanderbilt University, Asheesh Siddique, who is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and the conversation will be moderated by our colleague, Peter Mancall, Distinguished Professor, Andrew W. Mellon Professor of the Humanities, Linda and Harlan Martins, Director of the Early Modern Studies Institute, and Professor of History, Anthropology, and Economics at USC. If you are able to turn on your camera, please do so. It is much more convivial, if possible, if the author can see the faces of colleagues and friends who have come to hear her talk about her book. Our program is very straightforward. We will begin with a very quick introduction to the book by Lindsay, and then she will be in conversation with Catherine and Asheesh for roughly 30-35 minutes before we open it up for questions from the audience for the last 15 minutes. And at that point, we will let everyone know when we're open for questions and ask that you raise your Zoom hand and pose your question by voice and not using the chat. So thank you again for joining us. Lindsay, many congratulations. And please tell us about your book.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank Daniela and Zach and the Levan Institute for putting these together. It's a great forum to be able to kind of share your book on and be able to connect with people who aren't kind of in the LA area. So I'm going to do a really rapid kind of telling of the story of the journey of the two princes of Mpfumo for you. So I'm going to set my timer, make sure I don't go over time. So the story begins in 1716, where two elite men in Mpfumo, which is today's Maputo, which is the capital of Mozambique, see a ship that's licensed by the East India Company coming into port. And the princes look at the ship and they see opportunity. Their polity is struggling and they're looking for kind of answers, and ties with these English traders might answer them. So they board this ship, as the English sources say, to see England. The ship next stops in Madagascar to pick up enslaved Malagasy. It moves on to St. Helena to drop off a number of those enslaved Malagasy, before moving on to the Caribbean, where it stops at Barbados, and then Jamaica. In Jamaica, the captain of the ship looks at these two men and decides that they are worth more to him as enslaved laborers than they are as trading allies. And so he sells them into slavery in Jamaica. They're there for about 2 years, according to the English sources, constantly telling their story, until someone who turns out to be a lawyer named Joshua Bowes listens, purchases them, frees them, and decides to take them to London.
You're on the camera. You know.
Sorry, Mom, Mom, you gotta mute it.
Okay.
Thanks, Mom. It's good to have everyone here. So they are in London, and once they are there, they become minor celebrities. And first, they turn to the East India Company to help find a way home. The East India Company is briefly interested and decides not to help. We can talk about that in questions if people want. Then the Royal African Company gets involved and sets up a journey home for these two men, along with the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge. And And then they get on a boat to go home. And really, for these guys, they should never get on a ship. They get on this boat, and at this point, one of the princes, Prince James, starts to have what we would think of as a mental health crisis. He fights with his brother, he threatens to cut his own throat, and things are going from bad to worse. And then the ship hits a storm in the middle of the English Channel. They have to go into port. They almost wreck the ship going into port, and so they have to stay for repairs for about 2 months. Prince James does not improve once he is in Exmouth, and he continues to fight with his brother, to swear, to drink, to try to get back to London. And he has one final blowout with the captain and his brother, and he ends up going door to door in Exmouth to look for someone to take him in one night. No one will, and he ends up committing suicide in Exmouth that night. He's buried there. The voyage continues, and Prince John remains on board. And then they stop first at a small island in the middle of the Atlantic looking for minerals and riches. They don't find them. They stop off the coast of Brazil looking for trading ties. They don't find them there either. They then stop at the Cape of Good Hope, and more hopes are dashed when they find out the Dutch have started up a settlement in the prince's homeland. They almost turn back, but they don't. They continue on to Maputo Bay, where Prince John finally makes it home. There's a brief period of time when trading prospers between the English and the Mufomans. It quickly sours. The prince's polity takes the captain and the crew captive, and they almost kill them. The Dutch disagree. They manage to escape. They get on the ship, and then they get the hell out of Dodge. But Prince John remains at home and becomes an influential man in his polity. So that's the general story. So hopefully the questions can flesh out kind of the different ways I approach this, and I'm open for questions for details. So I'll stop there.
So I think I'm supposed to go first. And I thought I would I'm very interested in the origin stories of books. So I'm curious how you got from your first book, The Open Letter, to this project, and particularly whether it came through someone like John Percival. So if you ran across letters about the princess and that sort of led you into this unfolding story.
It's as though you read my mind, Catherine. So yeah, this story kind of followed me along when I was doing research for the first book. So my first book was about letter writing in the larger British world, and a lot of the letter writers I was reading got involved with these princes. So it was John Percival, it was the Duke of Chandos, it was Hans Sloane. So I kept running into this story, and I was like, this is a crazy story. And this is also a story that doesn't make sense in the way we think about the slave trade kind of at the time. Why is it happening in the Indian Ocean basin? How do these men get freed? So it was a story that left me with so many questions that I wanted to kind of follow up on it. And I have to say, I was looking forward to kind of telling a story kind of as well.
And it is an incredible story. And one of the things that I think is interesting, and one of the many Incredibles contributions that you make is that you show, I think, us a very different picture of the early modern British Empire than we're accustomed to. Many of us, and I'm seeing some of the folks on this call, would probably identify as Atlanticists. And your story is partly about the Atlantic world, but it's also about the Indian Ocean. It's about Europe. It's about Britain, but it's also about Africa. Can you tell us a little bit about how the prince's story and their movements help us see the British Empire as a kind of a global phenomenon?
Yeah, I think that was really one of the things I learned trying to piece this story together. We draw these borders between kind of the Atlantic world and the Indian Ocean world. And this story did not stay contained, within those borders that we as historians kind of draw. And I think that's in many ways one of the reasons that following people or projects is really helpful because it brings us, we have to follow those people where they go, and where they go sometimes crosses borders we don't expect them to cross. And I thought it was really interesting that it wasn't just the princes and their voyages and where they were going, but it was the way the people they engaged with were thinking about the world around them. So the East India Company was thinking about getting involved in the Atlantic slave trade, right? The Royal African Company was thinking about, could it get into, what's going on in the Indian Ocean or in the interior of Africa, right? So kind of the stories and the way people were thinking at that time just gave me this much more bigger global picture than one that we have, if we kind of, follow the scholarship. So that was one of the intriguing, fun things about this project.
Just to follow up on that, I was actually completely fascinated by the fact that at a certain point along the African coast, it's quicker to get to the interior from the opposite Indian Ocean side. And that was something I had never thought of, given that my focus is usually up in the Western African section. So that story, again, about tying these Indian Ocean Atlantic worlds together in new ways was also captivating to me. And I was just wondering if that's the sort of main message you want readers to take away from the book, or if there's anything else that might also be something that you think this particular story of these two men can sort of give us.
Yeah, so one is the global story. Other things that I think I'd like people to take away is the different ways people or the British were looking to exploit Africa as well. It wasn't, slave trade was the main dominant way they were thinking about Africa and its resources. But these are people who are looking for alternatives to that as well. Gold trade, this sort of thing. So thinking about how to get to the interior, that was the story there. And then I think one of the things that struck me when I was doing this is how different things look from the east coast of Africa, right? That this isn't a story. Slavery is there, but it's not necessarily the main story. And it's also a place where the entanglements between the Europeans and the kind of, African polities is slightly different than what we see on the West Coast. And these, the princes at the beginning probably didn't know about slavery, and they were able to keep the slave trade out of Mpfumo, until the 19th century, right? So the power of those polities operated differently and wasn't as entangled as we see on the West Coast. So it does tell us a different story about European engagements with Africa as well. So, there's a bunch, the global story also kind of brings in the story of the power of those African polities and these kind of different ways to see kind of Africa as well.
One of the really striking things about the Prince's story is that it brings them into interaction with a lot of different parts of the kind of the sort of the cast of characters who kind of we think of as sort of making up the early modern British Empire. They are involved with the Royal African Company. They also have entanglements with the East India Company, and they have entanglements with missionaries, as you show in the book. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about um, how they were entangled with all of these different institutions, which we often kind of don't really think about, people who are so deeply enmeshed in all of them. And also maybe if you could say a little bit about what you think, looking at kind of corporate institutions and to be a little bit anachronistic, sort of civil society organizations in an early modern empire can tell us that might be a little bit different from writing these histories kind of solely from the perspective of the state.
Yeah, so this, this goes back to the point about the stories, right? So stories show us and people show us entanglements, right? So one of the really interesting things was looking at how many different people who were involved with the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge were also involved with the East India Company or had connections with the Royal African Company. Most of these people knew each other, interacted. So it shows us the entangled nature, one, not drawing lines between the different companies, right? But to your other question, this is also a look at the imperial world that is looking at the actions of both individuals and companies rather than anything powered by the state, right? Like connections, to the state and state policies, I think, matter to these people, but it's being powered by these kind of powerful kind of individuals, both in the trading companies kind of and beyond this. I mean, I think one of the points I make in the book too is, you know, if it wasn't for the Duke of Chandos in the Royal African Company, the Royal African Company would not have been interested in the princes. So he has kind of an overweening influence on the company itself. And John Percival in the Society for Christian Knowledge, if he hadn't pushed the princes as a cause for the society, they probably wouldn't have followed through. So you even see the power of these individuals within these different kind of state entities, but it's also these kind of informal kind of corporate identities. And, you know, also that it's these kind of informal groups that are also kind of pushing for these new projects of expansion. You know, it's not coming from the state, and those corporate groups are run with individuals, you know, with very, you know, kind of diverse and kind of interesting kind of plans as well. So yeah, so it shows us a much more kind of complex view of imperial expansion that's not just tied to the state, or even in some ways just tied to these corporate institutions.
Wonder if I can shift our conversation just a little bit to talk a little about your methodology and the archive base of your project. So I have a bunch of questions about your archival base, in part because I'm writing a very similar book, but about a later guy. And the archival imprint looks very different from him. So at some point we should have a conversation about this on our own time. But I'm wondering sort of, first, in your reconstruction of the Mozambique area, are you upstreaming from modern studies of Africa or studies of modern Africa? Are you using archaeological data? I was sort of wondering where you were getting like the cattle herding information and the dining practices, which offer so much liveliness in the text, but I was just curious about how you went about constructing those.
Yeah, I mean, I will say one of the hardest parts about this project was trying to understand what was going on in kind of the Maputo Bay or Delagoa area, because even Africanists have not done that much work kind of on that area. So I kind of start with there's a UCLA dissertation, Carla, from 1970, right, which actually has the best kind of archival information on the area. And I went back through his sources, and he uses a lot of the Dutch sources, the Dutch East India Company. So some of it comes from the Dutch East India Company records and that dissertation. And someone should really do a better job at looking at the Dutch East India Company in that area. I think that'd be a really interesting story. So there's that, but there's also, you know, some of it is using, you know, there's a story put together by, or a book put together by a kind of missionary-like figure in the 19th century, right? Where some of that, it's Hunnick, where some of that information's coming from, which, you know, you kind of enter that and you're not sure, you know, what you can trust, what you shouldn't trust with it. But, you know, with all the sparse kind of sources, it's hard not to kind of at least kind of, you know, look at it for some basis, you know, with an acknowledgement of what it is. And, you know, but that's why, you know, for when I could, I tried to look at the, you know, look at those Dutch India sources as well. But even those, you know, you're still stuck with the European sources. I did reach out I tried to look for the archaeological information. I reached out, so I went to some Africanist kind of conferences, and whenever I met someone who did like the archaeology, I would like email them and be like, what don't I know? Tell me these things. And so they would tell me some things. And my colleague, Admira Maseba, works, you know, kind of on the East African coast as well on the earlier period. So I was kind of run by him, and he gave me some suggestions for kind of secondary sources as well. So it's building on kind of this kind of sparse, you know, both scholarly world and kind of European source primary world that's there. And I would love, you know, one of the things I hope to get that this project does is to get people to study that area more as well.
Which actually leads very well into my next question, because one of the things that I think is so incredible about your book and is that it is a methodologically very very thought-provoking, I think very convincing way of thinking about the speculative in writing history, and we don't often do that. And you know, one of the things you write, I'll just read a little bit from the prologue, is you note that The princes composed no records detailing their stories, and no accounts were written and retained that tell of their travels from the African perspective. If we approach the sources carefully, however, the princes' attempts to steer the course of their lives and their centrality to British plans surface. And you also write about how you kind of embraced, as you were writing this book, the speculative and terms like likely, perhaps, maybe. And that's often a territory that historians find very uncomfortable. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your kind of your method around the speculative, and how speculation might indeed be a very powerful tool to think about the histories of people who often do not are not well represented in the archive.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great struggles with this book was centering the princes in it, right? Because I didn't want this to be just a, so the main voices you hear are the voices from the sources, right? So, the Duke of Chandos, the Earl of Edgemont, right? These are where the East India Company, the Royal African Company, these are where the sources come from. And, kind of Catherine, to your other point, where you can kind of reconstruct these really rich kind of narratives. And so I kept challenging myself to look for the princes in the sources, right? So, and like, as with all our books, there's like 500 drafts of this, and some of the early drafts are like super speculative, in a way, just to get myself thinking as an exercise about thinking about how they might have been thinking about these things, and then kind of pulling back, from that. So I actually think, I in the prologue, I talk about the speculative nature there, but I think, if you read the text, I think that it's not there as much as you might think it is, to a certain degree, because I was trying to be kind of careful with it. But what I did try to do was start each chapter with the princes, right? Where were they at this point? What might they have seen? I try to stick to the exterior rather than the interior to a degree. Like, what were they seeing? What might this table have looked like when they were at dinner? Who was there? To kind of put you in the place of the princes looking outwards, rather than trying to put kind of thoughts into, their heads. And if I was going to make them, quote unquote, speak, what I would look for were, if they're in a meeting with the Royal African Company, where does it say in the record, the princes said this, right? Like, so that was a place where I felt I was on firmer ground to kind of, see where they might have been kind of pushing their story and their narrative and their opinions, more there. But it was it was a tricky process. But the thing but my main goal was to make sure that the princes were always on people's mind, even when we're digging more into the European kind of story, because I wanted this to be, their story rather than just a story about British expansion.
Just to sort of ask you to explore one particular instance of that sort of speculation, how did you approach the moment of the suicide?
I knew that was what you were gonna say. Yeah, that's another layer of unknowingness, right? So you don't know these men. You have only pictures of them through European sources. And then one takes his own life, which is something that, today and, forever, is something that seems kind of incomprehensible, to us, or we don't want to, like, we never know what's really going on with people when these things happen. But it's a moment that changes the story. And it's also a moment that, that is incomprehensible in the fact that this is a man who's going home, and it happens at a point in the story that we don't expect. So that's an unexpected moment. And I felt like you couldn't just leave it, right? Like, it wasn't something that you could just say, and he committed suicide. It's gonna, the readers are gonna be like, what is going on? So I think it was something I had to address. And I think I was talking to John Demos about this really early on in the project, and he was like, well, think of all the stresses, this guy kind of went through, right? And so I looked at that and I was like, well, so the first thing is, one, I can't explain why he did what he did. I don't want to explain that. but I do want to explain the context in which all this happened. So that chapter is very much structured around, one, just a reminder to us that all this guy has been through, a reminder of the different ways scholars have thought about kind of enslavement and suicide, and also how people at the time, thought about suicide, the different religions, et cetera. How did they perhaps going back to your Africa question, right? How did people in Mpfumo perhaps think about suicide, right? So kind of framing it around him while at the same time trying not to explain what he did, why he did what he did. And I also made the decision to start with that, in part because Peter said I should start with it too. Thank you, Peter. It also made sense in the end because it frames the story around violence and the strains on identity, right? So it starts with violence, and it also starts with a moment of despair, which this story can sound like a romp through much of it. And so it frames it in this very serious moment of loss. And so I wanted to start with that at the beginning for those reasons. And then, in the chapter, kind of dance around it to kind of contextualize what this might mean for the society. But yeah, it was a tricky moment that I kept thinking about.
One of the at one point toward the in the conclusion of the book, you write in the epilogue, the journeys of Prince John and Prince James show the limits of global power and global inclusion. British ships sailed to all corners of the world, and British societies and companies looked to these far corners for new opportunities secure in their knowledge and power. But visits do not equate to power, and assumed knowledge often masks ignorance. And I wondered if you could maybe reflect a little bit on that idea of the way that people in this world are moving around and traveling, in some cases great distances, but that doesn't always lead to kind of either cultural intelligibility or like what in kind of a modern kind of liberal notion of sort of inclusion, right? I mean, you're showing a world in which people are moving around and people are encountering a lot of difference, but they're actually not necessarily coming to enlightened per se conclusions about that difference. So I wondered if you could talk a little about kind of whether, the limits of, I guess, for lack of a better word, kind of cosmopolitanism in this period. I mean, I think one way of reading your story is at some level when you hear about the book, you're like, oh wow, how kind of cosmopolitan. But actually what you show is that there's some intense limits to how much prejudice and difference can be bridged.
Yeah, no, I think, the kind of two ways to kind of look at that. One is, this fact that the people in this story live within their bubbles, like no one ever, kind of crosses over and really tries to necessarily understand, those which they're dealing with. And then also, so I'll address that more. And also that all of this fails like spectacularly, right? Like none of these plans that the Duke of Chandos has works out. And so, there is also, being somewhere does not equate power, or knowledge. But I think your question is focusing more on kind of these limits of understanding. And yeah, it was something that kind of struck me kind of throughout this book. Okay, so I didn't say this before, but like, I don't know their names really, right? The Prince John and Prince James are names that are given to them when they're baptized, right? And they're not baptized until a while into their time in England. And that is because I'm relying on these European sources, right? And they tend to call these men the two princes constantly, right? They're not individualized as Prince John and Prince James until much later. And so that was a sign to me throughout this story, right? That they see these guys as opportunity, but they don't see them necessarily as kind of equals. They're interested in getting information about where they're from because they want to establish kind of trade, and they make kind of assumptions. And you can see the princes playing with those assumptions to perhaps get what they want. but there's not, at least, for these two men, an attempt at real understanding kind of beyond that. And on the prince's side, kind of as well, that also highlighted for me how might they see this, right? Do they really want to integrate, or are they putting on a show? Sorry, I'm getting a little cold. So, there's a lot of questions there.
I'll try and ask a really long question. So, I just to kind of build on this question of the princes, I'm really interested in how you might define, after finishing this book project, the category of an African or Black prince as it appears in predominantly European records. Near the end of the book, you actually broaden that category out to other 18th century Africans, which, by the way, Ayuba is not a prince, so he doesn't belong in that category. But I'm really interested in the way that if you think of this as a European category, an African category, some kind of cross-cultural category that is arising in the interstices between Europe and Africa, and how to handle the problem of this kind of imposition of European understandings of status and political titles, in this case, onto West African context. So how did you sort of juggle all of that?
Yeah, so these two men are it's very much a European kind of, imposition kind of on them, right? And the reason it's there is because the Europeans very much want them to be princes for the way they're kind of envisioning their engagement with Africa at this time. So it's very much an imposition kind of on them, in that I think they are looking, so, they see the Europeans see the way into trade as through kind of elite Africans, right? And kind of projecting kind of titles of kind of prince on them is a way for them, I think, to convince those around them that these people have a kind of influence that they and those around them would understand, right? Even though at the same time, the Europeans are kind of constantly saying, like, the so-called princes of Mpfumo, or, they call their princes in their land, right? But I think it's an attempt to establish tie a certain kind of authority to them that allows the Europeans to engage with them in a certain way that they, see as profitable. Back in their homeland, I think you can totally say that these are two men of influence. They are tied to the elite of their society. We know that and the Europeans will continue to see Prince John as a person, of authority in his own world. They see him as someone, there's a long story that he ends up part of a delegation that they send to the Cape at one point. So, I think it's very much the story is very much about how Europeans are using kind of the title of prince as a way to give these guys a status and differentiate them from the other uses of, African laborers and enslaved Africans, right? To tie them to to trade in a different sort of way. And I do think they have, a different standing, when you look at what's actually going on at home.
So I know that we're kind of coming to the point where we're going to be opening it up to more questions, but I wanted to ask a little bit about how you might envision this book being used in a classroom. How do you think that, how might you think about, how would you want, say, those of us who are kind of teaching Atlantic history, or maybe the history of the early modern British Empire, or even just the history of the early modern world, to think about integrating perhaps the story of the princes into the way that we teach this history, especially to undergraduates.
Yeah, so for one, everyone should teach a class on Africans in Britain, and they should sign my book and Catherine's book and Randy Sparks' book. But no, more seriously, like, I think this is a book that is useful for undergraduates because for many of the reasons we've been talking about, right? That this is a kind of unique way to think about slavery. So it takes kind of a known story, of enslavement, and then kind of, flips it a little bit to give this more kind of global story. It is something that, can help us kind of break down those walls we were talking about between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. So it kind of, if you're just teaching an Atlantic class, it reminds you of what else is going on. But also, I think hopefully the fact that they're looking at a story of people, right, I think is also matters and could kind of hook them in. And thirdly, I want them to interrogate what I'm doing, right? Like, I think it'd be useful in a class to be like, how do we feel about this historian, trying to tell the story of these two men whose voices we don't really hear, right? So I think it would be a useful book to lead to questions about kind of what historians do to methodology. Don't invite me, but they're welcome to tear it up, right? But I think it's an interesting. It should be a story that is both a good story and brings them into corners they might not otherwise go. But it also was, I think, a good book to kind of interrogate what historians do.
I think if Catherine and Asheesh can maybe do one more question each, and then we will open it up. And towards opening up, please use the raised hand function, and I'll call on you in the order in which I hope you appear. Okay, so Catherine, I think back over to you for a last question.
Great. First of all, I just want to say I absolutely loved reading this book. It was just really fun and interesting. So thank you for writing it and putting it out there in the world. And I'm just curious, I am also thinking a lot about storytelling and the way that that works in the context of slavery. And I'm curious as to why you think they were both successful in being able to communicate their stories, especially given that they weren't necessarily super fluent in English. And also why you think they didn't leave more letters behind after they learned to read and write.
Yeah, I mean, those silences, right? So, I mean, one, it takes them a long time to get someone to listen, right? To their story. So, in Jamaica, and I will say Jamaica is the least documented part of this story. Like, I really, and I say this, like, I'm relying on some, very kind of sparse sources. I think people, it does appear that they were differentiated from the beginning. Once the ship arrives in Jamaica, it appears that they were never in the hold with the rest of the enslaved Malagasy, and that thus they were in better shape. And I think they become curiosities from the beginning in Jamaica. And so I think that that's and I, like to be able to tell their story and be listened to, I make the argument that they probably don't leave like an urban kind of area, right, where their voices are going to circulate more. So I think, and Joshua Bowes, who frees them, is a really interesting guy who frees a lot of his few enslaved laborers in his will, but he doesn't give them their freedom until 10 years after his death, right? So like, he's an interesting kind of marginal kind of figure as well. So I think that's why their story is kind of listened to, because they were curiosities kind of early on. Was there a second part, Catherine, that I feel like I missed a strand?
Just why you think they didn't write more letters?
Oh, more letters. Yeah. They might have. I doubt that they were kept, right? Like, the letters that survive about these guys, and the reason I have the 2 letters that they wrote was because John Percival put them in his letter book, right? So I think it's about whose archives get to survive. And I also I also wonder how much they wanted them to be, their patrons wanted them to be writing letters.
Maybe one final question I had was whether you could maybe talk a little bit about how you think, or whether you think that this is a particularly early modern story. What does this tell us about, I think, the specific ways in which early modern cultural interaction worked that might be different from some of our ideas about, how globalization today worked, how under cross-cultural understanding might work. Is there a way that this story tells us something that's very specific about the early modern nature of globalization?
Yeah, well, Asheesh, I think it goes back to a lot of these questions you and I were discussing today, right? The fact that this is a world where Europeans fail. This is a world where expansion is pretty informal, right? And, while the British are successful and the Europeans are successful in many ways, it's still a place of a lot of negotiation, and, a time when racial understandings are still in formation, in a way they're not kind of later on. So I think it's very early modern in the fact that it's showing us the creation of worlds that we're more familiar with later. The creation of this wider British world, the creation of certain ideas about race. So I think that's the kind of early modern heart of the story.
Okay, that's great. So I want to thank Catherine and Asheesh. Those were amazing questions, and in fact, you stole most of the few questions I was going to ask, but they were just so on the mark. So if people want to use the raised hand function as you're getting ready for questions, I think I'll ask Lindsay one to get us rolling. Lindsay, the book, this fabulous book, is a pretty big intellectual pivot for you from a first book in which you had thousands of letters and we're tracing networks of them towards a study that is at its heart biographical, I think, or maybe you want to, and in a different historiographical genre in some sense. I mean, we live in an age of this explosion of fantastic studies of enslavement and the slave trade. I'm just wondering if you can just talk through that intellectual process, that journey that you went on in making that pivot. And then I can see hands starting. So then I'll go. Can you go on that one, please?
Yeah. So,
Thanks.
once I finished the first book, this story kind of haunted me. And I guess, at heart, I love telling stories. So I was like really kind of excited about exploring a new way to kind of write a book. And so I was like, well, let's try this and see what happens. And I did find the research process very different as well, right? Like the first book was all about read all the letters and say what they tell us, look for patterns. And this book was very much a treasure hunt, through the archives, which, so I enjoyed kind of just the change and trying these new skills out. And, it was, when I finished the first book, I didn't want to go into another kind of, big project. So I wanted to tell this story and and it was, very much something that kept, I think we started with this, kept popping its head up, during the first one and allowed me to kind of engage with, some other questions that were hiding in kind of the corners of the first book.
That's great. Thanks. Okay. So Daniela, question, please.
Thank you. It actually connects perfectly to what you were just talking, because I don't remember the word microhistory showing up in the entire book. And then I just looked at the index and it doesn't appear. And I almost want this book to have a, what is it called? Like this little guide for book clubs at the end with questions from the author, because this conversation has been so satisfying to listen to in terms of methodology and historiography. And the book is extremely readable, and you have such a light touch with questions of methodology and historiography that in a way are as interesting to many of us here as the historical cases, right? Because a historical case only exists within your framing. So I wanted to hear a little bit about how this book, writing this book, made you think about microhistory and global history, especially given that as the field of British imperial history has been a home for many of those projects.
Yeah, well, I'm noticing that my little Zoom square is right next to Keith Wrightson's Zoom square. And in grad school, I took a class on microhistories, right? So with him. So in many cases, microhistories have always been with me, through kind of my training in grad school. So it was always a part of the way I thought about the different ways we could construct the past, right? And, and was one of the way, when I was thinking about a new project, I was like, this is one way, this is, another kind of direction I could go in to kind of deal with these questions that I dealt with in the first book, but it can take me in a different direction. So the decision to write one was, was something that, was kind of embedded, in me for a while. And I will say, and this is probably popped up in a lot of this discussion, I do think that, and so the connection between, one of the connections between the first book and the second book is I'm interested in people, right? The first book was about how people connected, who they connected with, getting into, the ways they engage with each other. And a story is also, a microhistory is also about history, but telling us this broader story, right? So, and I do think stories and following people are ways to see intersections and another connection networks that we might not see if we look at an institution or we look at moments in kind of other ways. So I think the microhistories allow us to get into corners we might not otherwise kind of see. And I think that was one of the things that I really wanted this book to do.
Bella Shahani.
Hi. Hi,
Hey, Bella.
Professor O'Neill. I hope you're doing well. I had hoped to, I know during like the little presentation at the start, you mentioned that if anyone wanted to hear more about like the East India Company, that you'd elaborate on that. So I thought I'd ask about that. Also, I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Bella. I hope everything's going. So the East India Company is originally interested in the princes, and I'm laughing because you just were right next to Abby Swingen, who's gonna have the next question, who wrote a great article on what was going on with the East India Company right at this moment, which is one of their big kind of imports into England, which is calico, was under threat. And so the East India Company and the government were in conversations about what else could they get to help with this loss. And one of the things the East India Company was thinking about was joining the slave trade. And so they were interested in these men as a way to kind of access the slave trade, but also access possible gold that they thought might be in those areas. And so the princes interested in them for these experimental reasons early on. But the East India Company is a much better informational network than the Royal African Company has. And they kind of figure out that this is not going to pan out. And so they kind of drop their interest. They say like, we'll send them back, but they have to stop by Bombay first. And, and they were like, well, that doesn't sound like a good plan. So the East India Company drops out kind of relatively kind of early. So that's the East India Company story.
Abby.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Abby.
Hey folks, congratulations, Lindsay, and I'm so glad to see this, imprint after many discussions over the last few years. And my question relates to the previous one, in that I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how in many ways this is kind of a universal early modern encounter story, right? And as you say, it blurs artificial borders between Atlantic and Indian ocean worlds, for example. But it's also a fairly specific early 18th century story, right? Like a lot of these actors and a lot of the events that you're describing kind of could only have happened in this milieu that you're describing, at least in the British context. And so I was just wondering if you could, talk a little bit. I know we've had conversations over the years about how crazy 1720 was, for example, but just if you could expand a little bit more about how this is really an early 18th century story.
Yeah, no, and I do think we don't think enough about the early 18th century, as you and I both know, because that's what we do. And Amy Watson over there too. I see you nodding. Yeah, I think this is, it's a time of, a lot of flux, uncertainty, what I would think of as, not well thought out projects kind of going on. But it's also, a time when people are rethinking imperial expansion, and also a time of crisis. I want to touch on the South Sea bubbles happening just as, one of the first big for those of you who don't know, one of the big first financial bubbles kind of bursts right when the princes are in London, right when this is setting up. So this new kind of financial world that Abby's actually doing with her book right now that's emerging, that the princes are part of. It's a story about, what these companies would only act in these ways, at this, certain time. The slave trade itself is under transformation kind of at this time. Jamaica is transforming into the Jamaica kind of that we know right at this time. So it's very much a story that is very particular to the early 18th century, where, a lot of the things we see later in the century, are more solidified, which gives, there's the excitement of new things, but there's also anxiety about that, and kind of a flexibility or give that's in that period that we don't kind of see later, which I think is a really interesting period to kind of explore for those reasons.
Okay, I'm looking for hands. Not seeing one. I'm going to ask Lindsay another question. Okay, I'm asking Lindsay a question. Lindsay, I want to just hang on what you just said to Abby a second ago about the early 18th century as a sort of transformational moment. And I guess I just want to push you a little bit to talk about, I mean, your book is coming out. There are a lot of, I'll get you in. Oh, okay. Well, I'm in the middle of a question. Now I'm going to ask it. Sorry. Sorry, now the hands pop up. Anyway, can you just be quick, specific about what's changing in the slave trade at this moment that you're referring to? And then we'll go back to the hands.
Yeah. So, this is the period where so the slave trade used to be controlled more by companies, right? So like the Royal African Company. But the Royal African Company, which used to control trade on the West African coast, for those of you who don't know, kind of lost a lot of its authority to control that trade. And there's big pushes, both in kind of the political realm by kind of traders who want to open up trade to people who didn't have to follow kind of the company's rules. So we see a switch from kind of company-owned slave trade to one that's by and managed by kind of independent kind of traders. And this is also the point when the slave trade starts ratcheting up, right? So not only do we see a change in the way it's run, but we see a change in the amount of enslaved people that they're demanding from the Caribbean, and that they're looking to kind of supply from, it's going to stay mostly a West African story with the slave trade. But the reason they end up in Mpfumo or near Madagascar, which is where they would get a lot of their enslaved labor in the Indian Ocean world, they're there because they're looking for, it's because it's become so competitive on the West Coast. So new ways to do it, greater demand.
Thank you. I may have mispronounced it. Cheyenne Park, please.
Yes. Thank you so much for your time today. I was curious if any works or biographies have been written about the Two Princes before, aside from primary sources that you mentioned. And then I was wondering if in the field of history, can new knowledge production come in the form of synthesizing biographies and secondary sources to say something new? Or do you have to find something new in the archives that's never been cited before?
I mean, I think new knowledge can come from anywhere, right? It depends on how you are going to approach, those sources that are already there. I know there's, later kind of prominent Africans who show up in Britain who have kind of stories kind of written by them. And there's also who's telling those stories, who's writing those biographies, why. So there's just different stories, I think, that can be told from people who already have biographies or wrote what we think of as autobiographies. The princes, historians have mentioned them, but it comes only from the primary sources. So there is no kind of source, of the prince's story. The prince's story, before I put it together, existed only in fragments and letters and references in the archives.
Thanks. Okay, Alejandra, I think you may be the last question for us.
All right. Thank you so much, Lindsay. This has been wonderful. I guess I kind of want to know a little bit more. So you had to develop such amazing methodologies to think through all this. And one of the things that you asked us to think about if we assign this book is about methods and using this to interrogate. And since you just got a question about sort of, does this count as history? What are methods? So what are some like methodological either tools that you develop or skills that you want, like you really would want us to highlight in this book as we teach it or we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one where I want people to think about how we resurrect silenced voices from European sources, right? Like, I think that's an important thing for kind of, undergrads or grad students to kind of think about, like, and where are the boundaries, to that. We want to recognize the agency and existence, of people whose voices seem to be lost, but how much can we push the European sources without kind of betraying the people we're studying, right? So I think, very much, how do we try to resurrect kind of these stories of people, and how, where are the borders, and what we can do kind of with that. So I think that's an important one kind of for undergraduates, and also just, going back to the biography, how do we reconstruct stories? Where are the sources, for these things? They are all European sources, but it's also like, we don't have, the prince's story, we just have fragments. So how do we construct a big story out of fragmentary kind of evidence, as well?
That was great. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to throw it back to Daniela, I think, to close us out.
Thank you. This has been so smooth. I can't believe how the questions just flew back and forth so tightly. It is just my role to thank everyone for coming, to thank above all Catherine, Asheesh, and Peter for their role in this conversation. And of course, to thank Lindsay for giving us this wonderful book to read, to teach, to discuss. We already had someone in the chat saying, "You've sold me. Is this book on sale at the Huntington gift store?" So, run, don't walk to get your hands on a copy of Lindsay O'Neill's The Two Princes of Mpfumo. Thank you all so much for joining us. Many congratulations, Lindsay. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.